Good morning and a very warm welcome to this special broadcast. We're coming to you from the Inkosi Albert Lutuli International Convention Center, and this is the venue for the Conference of Parties COP17, a meeting of leaders and interested parties from around the world coming together to discuss the thorny issue. And I say thorny because it can sometimes get very controversial, but I think there's an urgency that people appreciate, and climate change is on the agenda, and we'll be keeping you informed right up until the end of the conference, up until the 9th of December. We'll be coming to you every single day, picking up the highlights of the issues that are being discussed, and we'll have guests in studio to unpack some of those items as they discuss some of the very weighty issues. And people have been saying that it's quite urgent now. Kyoto Protocol is one issue that's coming to the end of its tenure, and people are requiring some kind of a decision to be made in terms of renewing it. In a short while, we're going to be going into the conference hall itself to witness the ceremonial election of the president of COP17, and that's Minister Maite Shaban. And we'll also be hearing the official address of welcome opening the conference by South Africa's President Jacob Zuma. We'll be taking you through all of that in a few moments' time. But in the studio, I have with me a guest who's going to be helping us unpack some of those issues. Her name is Tasneem Essop, who is the Tasneem, you are the head of climate and strategy at WWF.
Yes, I am.
Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so we're getting ready for the opening session. We've been talking about it for months, a lot of anticipation. Some people don't even know it's going on, although the issues affect them directly. As we prepare for this, what are your thoughts going into COP17?
Well, as you correctly said, there are many people who have been engaged in this for months. As you clearly identified in your introduction, this is a critical session of the climate change negotiations. We have to make a decision about the urgency of action by countries, and all countries. As you know, there have been reports that last year was the highest year that we've experienced, the highest levels of emissions. So we have a real problem on our hands, and we do need this COP to reach agreements about taking action to prevent catastrophic climate change. And this, of course, means that our planet and our people are at risk, and we need leaders to be able to say in Durban, we're willing to take these actions. These are the kinds of actions we are taking, and this is how binding we are making these commitments. So this is essentially what we'd like to see happening.
Are we being alarmist? When you say urgent, how long is urgent? If we do nothing, is this planet going to disappear in the next few years?
Well, not the next few years. And we do not want to be alarmist, but we do need to ensure that people understand that there are very real impacts, and this is not a few individuals who are just raising the alarm, but there have been very clear science behind this. The United Nations panel of climate change has come up with clear signals of what can happen in the next 50 years and beyond. But what we're seeing already with the new science is that the time frames that they originally had thought this would be happening in has shortened, and so we are seeing a faster rate of some of those impacts already happening. Now, not everything is directly attributable to climate change. So if you see a flood here, we can't say, well, that's climate change. But certainly the issue of frequency of extreme events is something that the scientists have said is one of the impacts of climate change. And so we have to be aware that what we are witnessing are some of the impacts of climate change already in our lifetime. So if we do not act now, and we act with urgency, the way carbon emissions work, or the emissions work, is that it stays in the atmosphere, and we're already locking in a lot of that now. So there is an urgency in terms of time frames to act, and that is why this conference is really important.
COP16, Cancun, a lot of the things that you're saying were said then. What's happened in the year in between?
Well, Cancun was a good progression from Copenhagen. Of course, we were all disappointed. We expected the big deal to be struck. And Cancun laid the foundation, we believe, rebuilt the trust, and we thought that there would be momentum towards this. The one thing that Cancun did not achieve, however, is to resolve the big political issues. And that's exactly what is on the agenda of this Durban COP. The big political issues like the future of the Kyoto Protocol, the issue of finance and security and certainty about where the money will come from, those kinds of issues have not been resolved in Cancun, and it gets carried over into this Durban COP. That makes this COP a very difficult one and one of the most unpredictable COPs that I think I've been to.
Are there huge competing interests? Because I get a sense that this is part of the problem, is that everyone's coming there with their own agenda, hoping their agenda is fulfilled. Yes, we all love the planet and everything, but actually for us this is what's on the table. America, China, the developing nations have all coming to the party with a different viewpoint. Can we agree?
Well, of course, I mean, countries do come into this process having considered their own national interests, but I do believe that every country has a role to play in this. There is a sense that we need to put across that your national interest isn't antagonistic to also dealing with issues of the environment and sustainability and ensuring that we deal with climate change. There are lots of examples already of actions that have been taken that have been good for the economy, that have been good for the creation of jobs. So the idea that this is not in our national interest because we have our own economic problems is a false idea, and we need to look at ways that we can actually grow our economies, develop our economies, and at the same time save the planet and our people for the future. Yeah.
All right, Tasneem, we've got a lot to discuss and
Yes.
we'll unpack that. We're going to take a quick break, and when we do come back, we'll be starting to get ready for the opening session, the opening ceremony of COP17. Stay with us. All right, I can't hear a thing, hey? No, don't worry. You don't want to hear.
1 minute.
Okay, no, do something. I can't hear a thing, and I can't do this thing without being able to hear. Still can't hear anything. All right. I can't hear. Okay, so tell me exactly what we're going to do minute by minute.
Okay. Carry on with the interview.
And then for how long?
They're going to music plenary and now coming back to you. Leaders coming in.
Welcome back. We're at COP17 in Durban, and we're minutes away from the opening ceremony of this conference of parties, 194 parties, and South Africa is led by the Minister of Water Environmental Affairs. She'll be heading the delegation for the negotiations for South Africa, and there are various parties from around the world that have come together to try and discuss these urgent issues. And my guest today is Tasneem Essop from WWF. Tasneem, we were talking before the break about the urgency of some of these issues. What could be the drawbacks, as they start the negotiating in this round, that they really need to nip in the bud straight away?
Well, I think essentially it is the big issue about the future of the Kyoto Protocol, and we need to get countries. There are different positions about this. I mean, we know that there are some countries who have already signaled that they're not going to be part of a second commitment period, so Japan and Russia and Canada. There are others who have said, well, they're willing to look at it, but there are certain conditions. Now, those conditions are interesting because essentially what the EU, who said this, is saying that we would like to see those parties who are not part of the Kyoto Protocol, but who are developed countries like the United States, should do things that are comparable to what they would do if they do take a second commitment period. But added to that, they've also said, we would like to see, especially the major developing countries, commit themselves to some kind of legally binding climate regime in the future, not at Durban, but in the future. So if we can get parties to shift their positions on this matter, we could have a basis for negotiations here. If there's going to be an entrenching of positions, there's a real risk that we will not find any movement on that particular issue. And then secondly, the big issue is, of course, finance. One of the things that we expected is a decision in this COP on the Green Climate Fund, the fund that will have to deal with impact actions around climate change. And many developing countries need that, and need that quite urgently. And so that's become quite an important issue, that the Green Climate Fund must be agreed to, but we also need to know where the money is going to come from. And so for me, it would be resolving the issue of the legal certainty into the future, as well as making sure that we actually have the money to deal with the problem.
All right, so it's unlikely we're going to get a legally binding agreement out of this.
Yep.
And that will mean another year and another year. Are you optimistic that we will ever get to that point?
Well, I think that we need to look at it in a bigger view, that this is an important process and we need to, as fast as possible, try and get countries to reach agreements. And hopefully this will lay the basis of that, and it will lay the basis with a timeline in mind as well. But we can't, well, I always believe that, there's a saying that says, trust in God, but tie your camel. So we need to continue in this process and pressurize it as far as possible. But we also need to work back home, domestically. So what our governments are doing right now in terms of already acting, and many countries have already started doing that. We know that China, in the domestic domain, their 5-year plans have progressively looked at setting these more ambitious targets for themselves, and they've been acting. South Africa started to look at this. They've developed policies and already some plans around this. And we can just pick off a number of countries who are already acting. And what we need to do is look at this process together with urgent action on the ground in our different countries. And I think the combination of those two give me hope that we really can push the urgency, especially in terms of action.
This carbon trading idea, it sounds like a good idea on paper and in theory, but is it a good idea that polluters can basically buy their way out of trouble?
Well, look, originally the idea was that they would do this and also at the same time help, especially developing countries, to fund their own actions as well. We do know that there have been limitations and weaknesses in the existing system. So, for example, there hasn't been massive accountability and transparency, and in fact, we have not seen the results in the atmosphere. We have not seen that emissions have come down. In fact, we've seen it go up. And so what we need to do in this new agreement that we talk about is to tighten up those regulations, those rules, to ensure that we do see the results.
Okay. All right, we're starting to see images of people in the conference center now. That's the Deputy President of South Africa, Kgalema Motlanthe, arriving. These delegates that we're seeing there, who are they, and what is their role?
South Africa has two roles to play, essentially. The one is the role as COP President, and our Minister of International Relations is the COP President. And then we have our Minister of Environmental Affairs, who would lead the delegation, as you said. Our Deputy President has arrived. He's played a critical role in supporting our policies and actions, been very vocal about addressing the matter. And we see many of our ministers as well. The Minister of Economic Development we've seen, and we've also seen our Ambassador at Large for Climate Change, who's been helping the COP President facilitate diplomatic discussions between countries.
What happens then in the process once they start the negotiating? 194 people come into a room. What happens?
Well, essentially today will be the opening and the ceremonial thing. The COP President will then define a process for the negotiations to happen. Now, she could set up a team, a group of countries around her that will be acting as her advisors to the process. They call it friends of the President or something. She could do that and then break up the conference into issue-specific negotiations, or they would get into a formal process where they would have what they call groups, very wide groups that break up into smaller groups. So they'll have to decide how they'll do this. Essentially, there's a point at which the process actually goes into small room negotiations. In Cancun, a lot of that happened. There were ministers who were deployed to facilitate negotiations as well. So we'll have to see. There are points at which the process could also change, depending on where we are on certain issues. The President guides much of that as well.
And the heads of these delegations, they have full power to negotiate, or do they have to refer back?
I think all of the delegations come here with a mandate from their government, but of course in any mandate there's some flexibility, and I'm sure that when the real issues get to crunch time, they will be phoning their capitals.
I mean, I'm just thinking, next year Barack Obama is going to try and get himself re-elected. I guess this green issue is going to be something on the agenda. Might that affect what happens at COP17?
I think we've already seen some of that play into our negotiations in this year, for example. Lots of the domestic politics, of course, would affect the negotiations and what kinds of positions you can take, whether you can come with constructive and clear offers on the table. And that's not just in relation to the United States. I think many countries do come here with a sense of what's possible for them. And that's where we think everybody has a role to play, to come out with compromise and look at how we move the process forward.
Okay, Minister Edna Molewa, Environment, Water Affairs and Environment. What is urgent for South Africa that we need to take to the negotiations?
I think for South Africa, they've made it clear that they know that the big issue is to look at the future and reach agreements around the future of the Kyoto Protocol. But I do know South Africa recognizes that it also has to be a responsible global citizen. And so it has been committed as a country to take legally binding commitments in the future. So they've made it very clear that while we want a second commitment period from developed countries, we also need to get parties to start considering their own efforts and seeing whether that's binding or not.
They say that they've done a lot of, work on the ground to get people to understand climate change and so on and so forth. But a survey that came out recently is saying that a lot of people don't know much about it. Is that what's going to hold us back? Because I guess everybody in their households has to do their bit before we start to really make a difference.
I think it's really important that we have general awareness, and it's one of the biggest challenges, because this issue can be, especially in the process, it can be really complex and complicated, and ordinary people are just not engaged with this. But it's fundamentally important that our citizens are active, not only because they need to effect changes in their own lifestyles, but also because they need to put pressure on governments to act. in South Africa, it's not the broader majority of poor people who are contributing to the problems. We know in South Africa, in fact, who the big polluters are. And so we would need to have tough decisions made by our government, and we need an active citizenry. And so the awareness and the information and the empowering of our people is really important, so that we can put pressure on those that are causing the problems. And in fact, the impacts will be felt by the most vulnerable and the most poor. So yes, certainly we need to do much about that.
And in fact, we're going to take a quick break again, and we'll carry on chatting a little bit about that, because I am quite concerned about the ordinary guy in the rural areas who, for him, he's making decisions about, chopping a tree down to live. And we're busy trying to tell him, listen, we need to grow trees. But we'll chat about that after the break, as we start to get ready for the opening ceremony of COP17. Stay with us. Voice heard, actually.
Well, look, they do
these
have
negotiations.
They've actually become stronger and stronger. They've become more assertive.
Okay. And why is that? You're watching a special broadcast of COP17. We're here in Durban at the Nkosi Albert Lutuli International Conference Center, and in a few moments' time you can see delegates already starting to arrive there and getting ready. This is the COP17, as I said, live from Durban, and we're expecting President Jacob Zuma to address the delegates that are arriving there, and also seeing the investiture of the new president of COP17, our own Minister Maite Shaban. So all of that happening in just after 10 o'clock, and we'll be crossing to the proceedings live at about 10 o'clock. At the moment we're busy discussing some of those issues and what's likely to come out of this conference with Tasneem Essop from WWF. Tasneem, this is the African COP. Is that significant? What does that mean for the continent?
Well, I think it is extremely significant. To have this critical COP on African soil is an immense challenge. It means that parties come here, countries come here understanding that they are going to be making agreements or not reaching agreements on the soil of the continent that happens to be one of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. On this continent, we know that with climate change impacts, we are going to have huge impacts on livelihoods, on food, on water. We are going to have huge impacts on the environment, biodiversity loss. So extreme weather events, there'll be droughts and floods. This is going to be where a lot of those impacts are felt the hardest. So yes, when people meet here and our leaders come to negotiate, they need to bear that in mind, that they are actually going to be dealing with the future of the people in this continent. So that's why this is a critical African COP.
So we're potentially amongst, with other developing nations, the biggest sufferers of climate change. But is our voice being heard at these negotiations?
Well, Africa, the Africa group, of course, have become far more assertive in these COPs for the past few years, and certainly they have been very determined to get an agreement that is in the interests of Africa. So they've been very well organized, very assertive, they know what they want, and they speak with one voice. They come into these negotiations knowing that they need to speak with one voice. And of course, South Africa is part of the Africa group, and what is a priority for Africa is a priority for South Africa. So certainly when we deal with negotiations here in Durban, the South African delegation will be very aware that they need to be also working hard to get agreements on the priorities for Africa. So adaptation is a big priority for Africa. How we can deal with the impact of climate change, how will we get support to deal with those impacts, is a very big issue for Africa and South Africa.
All right, so there's a united African position. As the days unfold, who are likely the key characters that are going to be speaking, that are going to influence the way negotiations move forward?
Well, Peter, across the board, there are different negotiating blocks. And so, for instance, the G77, the chair of the G77 is going to be an important key figure in these negotiations. Of course, he doesn't take any position as an individual. He's informed by the mandate of the G77. So I think what we need to look at is who are the key blocks they're all key, but certainly where the tough negotiations will happen will be between the G77, the bloc that represents the developing world, and we will have tough negotiations then with the other blocs from the developed world, like something called the umbrella group, where we would find Japan, Russia, Canada, the US in that kind of bloc. And then there's been a lot of opening up between the EU and the G77, discussions happening around how they could move the process forward. So there are key players. AOSIS, as the representatives of the small island states, have a very important role to play. The least developing countries, their voices, the fact that what is at stake is their survival, these are very important blocks. So all of them have a role to play. How they will pull all this together is something that it's very unpredictable right now, and we do hope that they can pull this all together in the end.
And Minister Maite Mkhwana-Shabane, as president, how much influence will she actually have? Is this a ceremonial position, or is this actually a position of power and influence?
Well, the COP presidency is not a ceremonial position. As we've seen with previous COP presidencies, a COP president can either make or break a negotiation. And so the way the process is managed, the fact that we need to ensure that this is an inclusive and transparent process, the way that you manage the difficult issues, not just be ceremonial, but in fact provide leadership and facilitate agreements amongst parties, is going to be critical. And being the Minister of International Relations, Minister obviously brings a lot of that experience, a diplomatic experience into this process. And so hopefully that will also help, given that she has that experience. So the presidency plays a critical role. It's not a role that is just ceremonial. Absolutely not. In Cancun, we witnessed a strong president can make a real difference. Obviously not imposing on things, but certainly providing leadership. It does play a very important role.
All right, so you're talking about in fact, we're going to have to take a quick break again. We'll continue chatting a little bit more about that, because I'm curious about what role these presidents have played, and we'll find out what has been happening with the president who was appointed, Patricia Espinos Castellano, in Cancun. All right, we take a quick break, as I said, and we'll be back with more from Durban COP17. Good morning and welcome to this special broadcast on SABC3 of the COP17 climate change conference that's taking place at the Nkosi Albert Lutuli International Conference Center, and delegates are busy waiting now. The proceedings were supposed to get underway at 10 o'clock sharp. Delegates are still milling around waiting for the leadership. There'll be, I think, 6 or 7 people up on the stage there, including the outgoing president of which is COP16, Patricia Espina Castanella, and we're expecting Maite Nkwana Mashaban, Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Republic of South Africa, as the incoming president. And we'll also probably see Cristina Figueres, who's the executive secretary. And when she comes up, I'll tell you a little bit more about her, but she's been in the game for many, many years, so she's probably got this most senior executive position within the climate change story there at the UNFCCC. And we might see Horatio Pelufo, who's the Protocol and External Relations Officer. And also I'm told that we might see Vusi Kulwane, who's the Chief of State Protocol in South Africa. So some of the key figures that we're likely to see on stage in a short while once proceedings begin. And as I say, we're seeing so many delegates that have arrived from many countries around the world for this COP17, the United Nations Climate Change Conference 2011. And it's a big one for South Africa and the continent, given some of the issues that the continent and developing nations around the world face. And helping us unpack some of those issues, I'm joined once again by Tasneem Essop, who's with the WWF. These delegates that are there now, a lot of anticipation. Some of them have got negotiating power. Others are here as observers. What would they be interested in?
Besides the negotiations, of course, there's a lot happening around the conference. So many of them will be attending side events. There are lots of organizations that have come here to present what they're doing. Very interesting issues, reports that will be launched here. So there are lots of things happening outside of the negotiation process. A very small team of people probably would be there doing the hard negotiations. The rest of them are here to attend side events, but also to be part of a delegation that helps mandate those negotiators to continue with their negotiations. So yes, there's certainly much more than just the negotiations, although the negotiations are the core and critical elements of this COP.
Are green issues, I hate to use this word, but I've seen often sometimes causes can be fads, and that they have their time and their season. Is this climate change, green issues, a fad that we're getting into this age of being aware of the earth and then something else will come, or do you think that there is a consciousness that's genuinely developing?
I do think that there is a growing consciousness, that people are becoming aware that something's happening and will be getting worse. So there is a consciousness. I don't think that it's necessarily deep enough and broad enough, but certainly there is a growing awareness. And for some it might be a fad, but for others who really get into this more deeply, understand it more fundamentally, this would be about transforming their own lifestyles, looking at how they can contribute to it. Certainly individuals play a role, but as I said earlier, we also need to look at the role of business and what they do in terms of their business practices, the way they produce, the way they consume. So I think we need to look at all role players, not just government, but citizens broadly and the private sector. So there's a growing awareness, but I do think we do have a challenge of actually deepening that and translating that into action.
What about those dissident voices that we hear? You at the beginning of our conversation, you talked about the science is there, but we've had hot and cold on our planet for millions of years. What's different about this window?
Well, as you know, there are always going to be those who would want to believe that this isn't a problem and that this is some kind of next big conspiracy. But we do know that the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a body of over 2,000 scientists across the world, and they're busy with their next report as well. And then there are other organizations, science organizations, who have contributed there. There's been a growing consensus that, in fact, what we're experiencing now is human-induced. There's a consensus about that. So whatever people would like to say about it.
How much of it is human-induced and how much of it could be just what would have happened anyway?
Well, there's a period in which we've seen that, in fact, emissions have risen quite dramatically, and that has had certain impacts already. So the link between that rise in a very short, over time, people talk about centuries or hundreds of years, these things are normal patterns. But what we're seeing is that in a very short period of time, very much linked to when we had started industrializing as a planet, we've seen that there's been a much more direct impact in terms of the kind of greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere and the impacts that that's going to have and
it's not
is
a
having.
Coincidence.
So it's not a coincidence. There's a direct correlation between when we started polluting and more so, and also the kinds of impacts that would have on climate change. So certainly it's not a normal cyclical thing that we're going to experience.
Are we doing enough in our schools then, perhaps? Because I'm thinking that perhaps this is where this conversation ought to start.
I think that lots of schools, very exciting things happening at schools already. I do know that there are elements of this in the school curriculum, so there's a structured way. But I do think we can ramp up much more, because what I suspect is that it's viewed as an environmental issue. But if we actually look at this has got fundamental implications for social well-being and our economic well-being. And I think that our young children of today, who are in fact going to be our future generations, will experience this and have to deal with this more sharply, that they need to be aware of the broader implications, not just an environmental issue. It's far more broad than that.
Okay, Tasneem, hold that thought. We're going to continue conversating after this short break as we continue to wait for the official proceedings to begin inside the International Conference Centre here in Durban. Stay with us. Hello and welcome back to Durban, where we are at the COP17 meeting conference on climate change. Very important issues on the agenda over the next week or so, taking us up until the 9th of December. And us, as the SABC, the national broadcaster, will be with you from here throughout that period of time, and we'll be bringing you the stories of each day, giving you blow-by-blow accounts of the negotiations and the outcomes, if there are any, during the course of that time. And we hope to be getting some of the key players as guests on the program each day, just to get their thoughts about some of the issues as they're being discussed. And the images you can see there are delegates that have come from countries right around the world. There are 194 Conference of Party members. That's what COP stands for, in case you didn't know. And this is COP17. COP16, of course, was held in Cancun in Mexico. And this time around, Africa has its opportunity to host the nations of the world to discuss climate change and perhaps get the will of all of those delegates there to negotiate some real conclusions, to get to some real conclusions and real deals that will save our planet. I woke up to a newspaper article today with Archbishop Desmond Tutu saying to these leaders, please save our planet for the sake of humanity. Joining me in studio, we have Tasneem Essop from the WWF. 194 nations, a lot of people have come here, big issues on the table, and people at home will constantly ask the question, is this not just another talk shop?
Well, I think that it's important to understand that in any United Nations process, it is difficult to reach agreements amongst 194 nations. It's difficult, it's complicated. This issue particularly is extremely complicated. As I said earlier, it's not just an environmental issue. Of course, it's fundamentally informed by what this does to the economies in all of the world, the impact on people. So it isn't an easy issue. So it's already difficult in that context to move the process much faster than what it has been now.
But why is it difficult? I mean, if our planet is going to disintegrate, I would think that that's quite an easy thing to say, that this is urgent, let's do something.
Yep.
We've seen how quickly people acted in Cote d'Ivoire or in Libya or in Syria, whatever. Somehow they just get it going. Do they not really believe that it's a serious issue?
Well, I think that they are very well informed as political leaders. They know what is at stake. And so a lot of this has got to do with whether they are willing to use their political resources and capacity to actually deal with this more urgently. That has been one of the key challenges. Can our political leaders rise above what they are obviously grappling with every day, their domestic challenges, and actually see this as a need to act in the interest of the globe? So it's for the global good that we need our leaders to start looking at this a bit, in a broader context. But certainly they have not shown that kind of leadership or demonstrated that leadership up to now, and we're very worried, and we would like to see them do this in this meeting. Certainly, exactly, we would think that they could do something and do it more urgently, but they haven't displayed that kind of leadership up to now, I would say.
Ban Ki-moon, what role would he play in something like this? Because I would think that, it's under the auspices of the United Nations. He's the top guy. Can he bring pressure to bear?
Well, he does play a role. He doesn't play a direct role. As you know, the executive secretary she manages the process, but he does have an influence, and so he's on occasion he has also set up certain panels that would help build the momentum in this process. We had the panel on global finance. Our Minister Trevor Manuel was on that panel as well, so he's done that kind of thing. He also can bring together heads of state. He has that capacity to in fact try and get heads of state to look at this, so he does play a role, but certainly in the process itself, it would be the executive secretary, that Cristina Figueres, that would play that role. And I do want to say, Peter,
yes.
when you were talking about who's going to be on the platform, I want to say that women are leading in this process. So I hope that that's a good signal for some kind of agreement.
They certainly are. I mean, let's talk about Patricia Espinosa, who's the outgoing COP president appointed at Cancun. Has she had a good year?
I think that as the COP president, she could feel happy that she delivered something that was positive, desperately needed after Copenhagen, that delegates could leave Cancun. I mean, at the closing plenary, people had stood up and they were really happy and applauded. And I think a sense of relief that we had come out of Cancun with something. What I do think we need to acknowledge is that a lot of it is an important basis for an agreement, but there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. But certainly as a COP president, she had known what she wanted. She went into that clearly understanding what the Mexicans need to deliver, and she managed the process in a way that they actually achieved that. So she's got a lot to be proud of.
All right, so it looks like there's a bit of movement happening there. We're getting some delegates walking in, standing up. I wonder if that isn't a sign actually that this whole process is starting to happen. We're seeing movements on the stage there. As we were saying earlier, we're expecting President Jacob Zuma to have an opening address, welcome everybody, and obviously set the tone, I guess, for the deliberations that are going to be taking place. We're likely to see also an acceptance speech from the incoming president, Minister Maite Nkwana Mashaban, Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of the Republic of South Africa, who is going to be president of COP17 going forwards for the next 12 months. And as an African delegate, African president, the issues of the continent certainly, I think, will be high on the agenda. And the woman that you can see there is the Executive Secretary, Cristina Figueres, who's been at this game for quite some time now. She was appointed Executive Secretary in May 2010, and she is a career diplomat herself, but spent many years as a negotiator for Costa Rica, 1995 to 2009, which is about 15 years in the game. And I'm told that she conceived the new financial instrument program CDM with 4 groundbreaking publications that marked global thinking on the novel concept. So at the helm of this organization is Executive Secretary Cristina Figueres, a very, very strong figure. Tasneem, another strong female, lots of experience, and I guess great appointment, but has she had time to assert her authority since May 2010?
Well, I do think that she has. She's obviously been through she was appointed ahead of Cancun. Cancun was a good experience for her. I think that would have allowed her to gain confidence in her ability to lead this process as well, and provide guidance. So I think that, of course, she would feel comfortable that she has been doing that.
And President Jacob Zuma is arriving there, and he's arriving with the President of COP16, Patricia Espinosa Castellano, as the outgoing president. She's still at the helm, but there's the President of South Africa, Dr. Jacob Zuma, who we're expecting in a short while will be addressing the delegates and opening officially COP17, which is coming to you from Durban this year. And there he is standing next to Cristina Figueres, who's the Executive Secretary of COP, and she's I'm sure quite anxious that this particular conference is going to be a success.
Yes, I'm sure she is.
What would she be saying to the president right now? Welcome.
Welcome, Mr. President.
All right. Is it a coincidence that there are women in power, really, in this climate environment?
Well, it's not a coincidence, maybe, that there are more women in leadership positions around the world.
Right. And that's the current president, COP16. That is Her Excellency Patricia Espinosa Castellano, who is the Secretary of Foreign Relations, COP16.
Dar la bienvenida a los dignatarios en la mesa y en primerísimo lugar
the persons at the podium. First of all, His Excellency Mr. Jacob Zuma, President of the Republic of South Africa, whom we thank for coming here today to be with us, and whose presence today will stress just how important this conference that we are inaugurating today is in this great country. President Zuma, on behalf of all of the delegates present here and participating at this conference, and also on behalf of the Secretariat, we would like to express our gratitude for the efforts made by the Republic of South Africa to organize this conference and for the hospitality which your government and your people have given us on our arrival here. I would also like to welcome His Excellency Mr. Idris Deby, the President of Chad, who is here representing the economic community of Central African states. Mr. President, you are most welcome here. I would also like to welcome Mr. Fernando da Piedade Dias dos Santos, Vice President of Angola, who is here as a representative of the Southern African Development Community. It is an honor for us to have you with us today. Distinguished delegates, before we continue with our program, I would like to ask that we devote 1 minute of silence to pay tribute to the memory of Mr. Mamadou Konate, the representative of Mali and chair of the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, the SUBSTA, who unfortunately passed away on 13 November last. Mama was a key actor in negotiations on climate change, and we will remember him not just for his professionalism but for his personal qualities. I would ask you to stand for 1 minute silence.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Quisiera ahora dar la palabra.
I would now like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mali. I would like to indicate that the regional groups will be able to make statements and pay tribute to Mr. Mamadou Konate, both in their general statements as well as at the opening session this afternoon of SUBSTA. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mali.
Sí, tiene la palabra el distinguido
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mali.
has the floor.
Son Excellence,
Your Excellence, President of the Republic of South Africa, Your Excellency, Mr. Idriss Déby, Madam President of the COP, Madam Executive Secretary of the Convention, ladies and gentlemen, it is very sad for me to pay this tribute, but I hope God will give me strength. On behalf of the Konate family, I am taking the floor to thank all the organizations, associations, parties, institutions, all the NGOs, for the condolences that we have received on behalf of the Konate family, all the personnel from meteorology, all of the people of Mali, distressed at the passing away on Monday the 14th of November, on the night of Sunday the 13th to Monday the 14th of November, where Mr. Konate was on mission to Bonn. All of those of us who have worked at his side and have had exchanges with Mamadou will keep him in our minds for a long time. He was born in Mali in 1950, and his primary studies he did in Mali, and then continued his higher education in Dakar in Senegal in mathematics, and then in France in meteorology. He also had specializations in agrometeorology, aeronautics, environment, climate change, studies that he followed a bit all over the world, in France, in Holland, in England, in the USA, in China, Germany, Japan, and Canada, just to mention a few. Nationally, Mr. Konate held the posts of head of the section and head of the division of research and development, the head of the agrometeorological division, deputy director for meteorology, national director for meteorology from 2002 onwards. He was the focal point for climate change, and he was a Chevalier of the National Order of Mali. He led many studies, national communication, PANA, strategy for communication, and he also led several projects, among them the meteorological assistance project for rural areas from the 1980s on. From the 1980s. And today this is considered one of the best examples of adaptation to climate change. The farmers' rain gauge, which was made up in those days, should now carry his name, Mama Rain Gauge. Internationally, he was the permanent representative of Mali to the WMO. He was expert and technical advisor for the National Agri-Met project of Senegal in Dakar for 8 years in order to try to replicate meteorological assistance to rural areas within the framework of an experience exchange. Regional Councillor in the Environment at the Canadian International Development Research Center. He was a coordinator of Group 77 in China for negotiations on research and systematic observations, president of the least developed countries and member of the African Negotiators Group Bureau. He was chair of the communication group of the African Group of Negotiators. He was vice chair of AWGKP, and finally he was the chair of SUBSTA, the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice. And it was as he finalized all the preparations for Durban that he passed away in Bonn on mission. Mama had made every effort in this climate change work and really felt that it was possible to achieve results. However, he would say to me, Bidama, the path is still a very lengthy one. In Panama, in the closing ceremony, he told me with regard to long-term financing for 2020, he said, that's for those who will be lucky enough to live to see that period. And I asked him, why are you saying this, boss? And he gave me a smile, as usual, without replying. And it was only on the 14th of November 2011 that I understood what he meant. So Mama, to a lot of you, was a colleague, a professor, and a friend. He was a model of humility, of calm, of rigor, and competence. He was also a religious man. Few people have served so long and so devotedly to the cause that we are so attached to. A struggle that will define the future of our lands, our countries, and our peoples. Regardless of the situation, Mama could never say no. And he would say, thanks to the will of God, there will always be a solution. Let us keep the faith. The African group and the whole negotiation community for climate change have lost a true leader and a builder of consensus. In fact, words fail me to be able to describe the great qualities of Mama Konate. Mama is leaving a wife and 4 children, but also a very difficult space to fill. We should all learn from his example. Let us try to perpetuate what he has left us and ensure that Durban can be a success so that his soul may rest at peace. The Konate family, the government, and the people of Mali, thank you for your compassion and all of the efforts by Madam, the Executive Secretary of the Convention, and her collaborators in the chair, the Secretariat of GIEC, for the measures taken to facilitate his funeral in Mali. May he rest in peace. Amen. I would like to thank the distinguished representative of Mali for these emotional words, and I think that we can all agree that the best tribute that we can pay to the memory of Mama Konate is to forge ahead with our work and be able to achieve results. And now I will give you my message.
Excelentísimo señor presidente Jacob Zuma, excelentísimo señor Idriss Déby, presidente de Chad, excelentísimo señor Fernando da Piedade Díaz dos Santos, vicepresidente de Angola, excelentísima señora ministra Maiten Kwana Mashabane, muy distinguida señora secretaria.
Your Excellency President Jacob Zuma, Your Excellency Idris Deby, President of Chad, Excellency Minister Mashabane, Your Excellency Fernando da Piedade dos Santos, Vice President of Angola, distinguished members of the Presidium, Executive Secretary, ministers and heads of delegation, friends all, members of states parties, members of NGOs, friends. First of all, I wish to convey to you, President Zuma, and to the representatives of the states parties to the convention, the fraternal greetings of President Felipe Calderón Hinojosa, who is not able to be with us as he would have liked due to his multiple responsibilities. I'm also pleased to extend to you the greetings of the Mexican people who welcomed you all last year and who hold very pleasant memories of your stay in our country. Seeing you reminds me of the enormous effort we made together in Cancun 1 year ago. The results obtained there have been recognized by experts and by the world at large. As the recovery of a multilateral process of central importance for humanity. I'm sure we all recall that at the beginning of last year's conference, there were serious doubts about the possibility of achieving any relevant results. In the consultations that Mexico made throughout the year, we always emphasized that a lack of results would seriously harm not only the international climate change regime, but the entire multilateral system. And so, true to its diplomatic tradition, Mexico made every effort within its power, with the firm conviction that dialogue and cooperation are the only instruments to face global changes. President Felipe Calderón personally played an active role in promoting the necessary political agreements to move forward on this task. We know this is a process that involves very complex technical issues, but one in which political will is the indispensable decision-making element. Based on this renewed confidence in Cancun, we were able to accomplish the following. The commitment to act so that global temperature increases are maintained below 2 degrees Celsius. Having a significant number of countries register medium-term mitigation targets and to continue working to improve transparency. Create the Cancun Adaptation Framework and the Adaptation Committee. We were able to foster the development and transfer of environmentally sustainable technologies through the technology mechanism and its networks and regional centers. We achieved the creation of a new financing mechanism, the Green Climate Fund, to support efforts made by developing countries. We were able to achieve a commitment to mobilize up to $100 billion annually as of 2020. The contribution of forests to mitigation was recognized and expanded, and we agreed to work on preventing the creation of a gap between the first and second periods of the Kyoto Protocol commitments. These were the results achieved in Cancun. Distinguished friends, we have taken important steps, but there is certainly more to do. The work we have done this year provides the elements needed for us to take another major step in the gradual construction of a strengthened regime. Each of our countries can and should contribute to this goal on the basis of each and everyone's responsibilities and capabilities. As President Calderon has said, and I quote, "Our global challenge is to find a definite solution that harmonizes development with sustainability. The challenge is being able to find and design public policies that effectively reduce climate change while also being economically viable." End of quote. In Durban, we must find the capacity to build a package of agreements including the following three areas. First, the full implementation of the Cancun agreements, including the implementation of the new institutions. Second, we should recognize that the financial pillar is essential in achieving increasingly ambitious goals. Aside from making the Green Climate Fund operational, we should agree on its capitalization and move forward in discussing long-term sources of financing. And third, we should define the future of the Kyoto Protocol, reaffirming the importance of a rules-based system, while recognizing the need to supplement these efforts through binding commitments of all states parties. This does not mean that the distinction between developed and developing countries, which appears in the Convention, is to disappear. Quite the contrary, the future regime should respect the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, as well as the fact that developed countries should take on more responsibilities. Let us now launch our vision for the future. Let us unite our wills. Let us identify and, even more importantly, commit to the actions we will each undertake to reach that goal, and not wait for others to act first. Each of us must take on our own responsibilities. Distinguished colleagues, in scarce 2 weeks, we must deliver results. There are millions of people, most of them in the poorest and most vulnerable countries, whose future depends on our decisions. We cannot betray the trust they have placed in us. There is political will and a keen sense of awareness concerning the seriousness of the problem. If that were not so, there would not be so much interest in our discussions, nor would there be almost 20,000 delegates in Durban. We would not be able to explain a lack of agreements or the adoption of marginal agreements when the seriousness of the problem lies before us. Many actors outside this process are ready to support our efforts. I have seen, for example, that women are actively seeking solutions and exercising leadership in their communities. Let us help empower them and boost their contributions. Dear colleagues and friends, Mexico recognizes the challenge and assumes its responsibilities. Our commitment to strengthening the climate change regime is not one that is related to the moment. We have a national emissions reduction program, and it is currently undergoing an external evaluation process. We have set ambitious midterm goals and periodically report our results. Soon, we hope to have a national climate change law, and we are currently preparing the 5th national communication. We will continue working to find fair and lasting solutions to climate change. This year, as announced by President Felipe Calderon at the end of COP17, we established the Center for Sustainable Development in Mexico, which will be fully operational in 2012. This center is available to the states so that they can achieve the goals we have set in creating the technology mechanism, and we offer it as a regional center. Distinguished delegates and friends, today, as I conclude my tenure as chair of COP17 CMP6, I wish to express my appreciation to all of you for your trust and support. To the Secretariat and especially Cristiana Figueres, who I thank for her tireless effort, commitment and support. My gratitude also goes to President Felipe Calderón for his leadership and permanent support. I thank my team for its extraordinary efforts throughout this process. This is a professional and personal experience I will treasure for the rest of my life. It is an honor for me to transfer this important responsibility to the capable hands of Minister Mashabane and her team. I invite all of you to join me in providing them our full support, just as you all have supported me during my presidency, so these Durban conferences can meet the very high expectations of our peoples. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you every success at this conference.
Distinguidos delegados,
distinguished delegates, I would now like to invite you to take up item 2A of the provisional agenda, election of the chair of the president for the 17th session of the conference. And I would ask you to take up document FCCC/CP/2011/1. As you may remember, in accordance with paragraph 1 of Article 22 of our Rules of Procedure, the presidency of the Conference of the Parties is subject to rotation among the 5 regional groups. On this occasion, the African group is to propose the president, and this has been done. And thus, it is an extreme pleasure for me to propose that the conference elect by acclamation Her Excellency Maite Nkwana Mashabane, the Minister of International Affairs and Cooperation of the Republic of South Africa, as President of the 17th session.
Declaro electa como presidenta del séptimo.
I declare the election of the President of the 17th session of the Conference of the Parties. Her Excellency Minister Nkwana Mashabane is declared elected. May I congratulate you, Minister Nkwana Mashabane, on your election and wish you every success in this session. I am convinced that all States Party will give all their support so that this session can take concrete steps in fighting global warming. I would now like to invite Minister Nkwana Mashabane to come and take her place on the podium.
Okay, yeah.
And so Minister Nkwana Mashabane takes her position on the stage as the newly elected president, COP17, and this honor has been given by this woman who she's hugging now, the outgoing president, Patricia Espinosa Castanelo of Mexico, who was appointed in Cancun, and there she's hugging Cristina Figueres, who's the executive secretary of the UNFCCC. As she takes her seat, she's the new president, sitting next to President Jacob Zuma, and I think she'll be getting down to business almost immediately as she takes up the reins for the next 12 months.
Your Excellencies, Excellency President Jacob Zuma, the President of the Republic of South Africa, Excellency the Deputy President of the Republic of South Africa, Deputy President Kgalema Motlanthe, the Excellency President of Chad, Excellency the Vice President of Angola, the cabinet members of the Republic of South Africa present here, the Premier of KwaZulu-Natal, Dr. Mkhize, with us here, all distinguished guests of our President, distinguished delegates, Sanbonani. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great honor that I have this opportunity to accept the responsibility to preside over COP17, COP17, on behalf of my country, South Africa, and its people. To the President of the Republic of South Africa, Mr. President Jacob Zuma, and his government, thank you very much for entrusting me with this mammoth task. I am privileged to receive this baton from a friend and a colleague and a dear sister now, Honorable Minister Patricia Espinosa, whom I hold in high regard for his stewardship of COP16, COP6. I have another friend to thank, the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, Ms. Christiana Figueres, who has been there for us, and her dedicated team. I'm sure this will continue into the future as we attach great value to a good relationship with the UNFCCC Secretariat. We have developed a warm chemistry with members of the Bureau, as well as the chairs of the various bodies of the UNFCCC process, and this is something we will continue throughout our co-presidency. Ultimately, it is parties, through your respective delegations and negotiators, who are the lifeblood of the UNFCCC process, with whom the co-presidency must work with and work well together. It is for this reason that I held and participated in a number of formal and informal consultations in our preparations for this conference. One of such informal consultations was the Continental Consultative Dialogue on the impact of climate change on women that we organized last week in Pretoria, whose outcomes will be made available to delegates. I am singling out this consultation, and not that the others were not important, but because we now have women leaders at the helm of this COP and its CMP. The outgoing president, a woman and a very capable woman, the executive secretary, a woman and a capable woman, and the incoming president. It's a very nice coincidence. So we will not miss this opportunity to make good use of it. The concern with climate change go beyond the walls of this very beautiful venue to the millions of our people out there in the streets who are calling for climate justice. Yesterday, together with the Executive Secretary, I received a petition from our faith-based communities from all over the world, demanding action and leadership from all of us in this room. Yes, we are in Durban with one purpose, and that is to find a common solution that will secure a future for generations to come. As I have promised, I will do my very best to bring parties together and to facilitate consensus. You will appreciate that we have very limited time at our disposal to get through a large and pressing volume of work. I intend to follow the UNFCCC party-driven process, which will be transparent, inclusive, in our endeavor to reach out to a balanced, fair, and credible outcome, which should be informed by the UNFCCC principles such as multilateralism, environmental integrity, fairness, by that we mean common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, equity, and honoring of all international commitments and undertakings made in the climate change process. I am optimistic, however, because as parties you have demonstrated to us in the many interactions we have had with you, your willingness to find each other and to tackle difficult questions. We will count on your boldness and your courage within the next coming days. Durban is a decisive moment for the future of the multilateral rule-based regime, which has evolved over many years under the Convention and its Kyoto Protocol. The first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol is about to come to an end. In the negotiations, the fate of the second commitment period is made dependent on the decision on the legal nature of the outcome and the negotiations under the Convention, as it is a question that has been left unanswered from Bali. It is also clear that this question, if this question is not resolved, the outcome of other matters in the negotiations will become extremely difficult. Therefore, a solution must be found. In addition, it is important that we also operationalize the Cancun agreements, including the establishment of the key mechanisms and institutional arrangements agreed upon in Cancun, such as the Green Climate Fund. When we focus on the Cancun agreements, adaptation has to be an essential element for any outcome, as it is a key priority for many developing countries. Colleagues, the bottom line is that we need to create an environment from where we will be able to work together. In this regard, I am hopeful that in the next 2 weeks, we will consider what we need to do now or immediately and what we need to do in the nearest future. I believe this approach will help us to find a way forward from here. Let Durban be the place where parties will be able to work together, giving each other the necessary reassurances to secure a platform of trust. We owe it, ladies and gentlemen, to the memory of our brother and colleague, Mama Konate from Mali, and the chair of the SAPSTA, and to our beloved sister and mother, the late Wangari Maathai, another soldier in the struggle for sustainable development, for both of them died with their boots on. To our distinguished excellencies who have graced this occasion, thank you very much for your guidance, wisdom, and support. Excellencies, dear delegates and friends, indeed we can prevail in the next 2 weeks when we work together to save tomorrow today. I thank you. Distinguished delegates, I would like to suspend the first meeting of the COP so that the welcoming ceremony can start, and immediately after that to resume the COP and continue with our work. Thank you.
To the official opening of the ceremony of COP17, CMP7, and Excellencies, we kindly call upon Ms. Christiana Figueres, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Good morning, Durban. Good morning, COP17. His Excellency, Mr. Jacob Zuma, President of the Republic of South Africa, His Excellency, Mr. Idris Deby, President of Chad, His Excellency, Mr. Fernando da Piedade Dias dos Santos, Vice President of Angola, His Excellency, Deputy President of South Africa, Mr. Hagalana Motlanthe, Her Excellency, Ms. Maite Nakwana Mashabane, President of COP17 and CMP7, Her Excellency Patricia Espinosa, President of COP16 and CMP6. Honorable Ministers and Vice Ministers, His Worship Mayor Mamadou, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to address you on African soil and to welcome you to COP17 and CMP7. In the Zulu language, I greet you, Sanbonani Nonke. My sincere thanks go to the city of Durban and to the South African government for their tireless work, both in terms of logistics and in terms of substance. Madam President, Mayor Nkamalo, through you, may I thank each and every member of your very committed teams for the detailed and most effective preparations, including all the overnight work due to the torrential blessings from the skies last night. Ladies and gentlemen, when the distinguished Nelson Mandela walked to freedom in 1990, nobody imagined that South Africa was on its way to becoming an inspiration to the world. When the CODESA negotiations started 20 years ago, almost to this day, nobody imagined that South Africa would become the world's model for negotiations for a better future. But when the first free and fair elections were held in this beautiful country in 1994, everyone knew that South Africa had achieved the impossible. It had mastered its biggest challenge, and that it had created a new and better future for itself. For the world, it was plain to see that South Africa stood proud and tall upon the political and moral high ground that it had built. And rightfully so, because almost against all odds, South Africa had successfully negotiated change. To quote the great former President Mandela, it always seems impossible until it is done. It would seem to me that this can-do attitude is something of a hallmark of this country's great people. And it would seem to me that this positive mindset is exactly the inspiration that we all need at this moment. We meet here at a time when more and more the impacts of climate change are threatening people's lives and livelihoods. As one of the regions most vulnerable to such impacts, many Africans unfortunately already have first-hand experience of the suffering that climate change can cause. We meet here at a time when greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere have never been higher, when the number of livelihoods that have been dissolved by climate change impacts have never been greater, and when the need for action has never been more compelling or more achievable. Ladies and gentlemen, the process needs to take two decisive steps here in Durban: finishing the tasks from COP16 and CMP6, and answering the key political questions that remained unanswered in Cancun. Finishing the task from Cancun means translating policy into concrete action. This includes launching the Adaptation Committee, approving the modalities and guidelines for national adaptation plans, and progress on approaches to address loss and damage. the full operationalization of the technology mechanism in the year 2012, and a clear process for selecting the host for the implementing arm of the mechanism. Consideration and approval of the Green Climate Fund's governing instrument and contributions for a prompt start-up of the fund. Continued progress on the emerging guidelines for monitoring, reporting, and verification. Defining the what and the how of the review, and gaining more clarity on Fast Start Finance, including via the Secretariat's new Fast Start Finance portal, which provides easy and transparent access to that information. These issues have progressed and can be concluded so that further action on the ground can be much stronger. At the same time, the unresolved political issues have not benefited from the same progress this year and need to be significantly advanced here in Durban. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my hope that through constructive negotiations, you will master this critical challenge. As you seek constructive ways forward on the Kyoto Protocol, the emerging mitigation framework, and on long-term funding, I urge you to remember it always seems impossible until it is done. It is clear that the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol is linked to launching a process towards a broader, multilateral, rules-based system under the Convention, providing greater rigor and structure to the global effort to tackle climate change. And this may only be possible if it is both fair, grounded on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, and responsible, enabling parties to tackle the gap in the level of ambition needed to limit global average temperature increases to below 2 degrees Celsius in a timely fashion. Finding a workable way forward in this complexity is the defining issue of this conference. On finance in the long term, there is a critical need to build trust that funds will continue to be scaled up post-2012. I urge you to decide on a pathway to secure mid- and long-term sources of finance, including innovative sources, as part of the outcome of this conference. Ladies and gentlemen, this conference needs to reassure the vulnerable, all those who have already suffered and all those who will continue to suffer from climate change, that tangible action is being taken for a safer future, both in adaptation and in mitigation. You need to reassure each other that you are all committed to finding concrete solutions. And you need to reassure the world that you are following the path of ambition with perseverance. Negotiating to master these challenges won't be easy, but I am convinced that South Africa's example can inspire you. I am convinced that you can take the next decisive step together. It may seem impossible, but you can get it done. Suguma Sake. Thank you.
Siyabonga, thank you so much. Please welcome His Honorable Excellency, the Vice President of Angola, Mr. Fernando da Piedade Dias dos Santos, representing the SADC.
Sua Excelência Jacob Zuma,
Your Excellency Jacob Zuma, President of the Republic of South Africa,
Sua Excelência Presidente da República,
Your Excellency, the Head of State and President of Chad,
minhas senhoras,
distinguished guests,
meus senhores,
ladies and gentlemen,
em nome de Sua Excelência,
on behalf
Engenheiro José
of His Excellency Engineer José Eduardo dos Santos, President of the Republic of
saúdo a
Angola,
realização de mais esta conferência
I commend the holding of this conference because it echoes the desire of all of us to increase our knowledge on the threats faced by our countries and our people due to the growing and worrying increase of the greenhouse effect on the atmosphere of the planet, with climate changes that follow. I'm confident that this conference will approve a global agreement on the international legal regime on climate change, and that shall launch the functioning of some institutions created under the Cancun agreements in December 2010, namely the Green Climate Fund and the Technology Transfer Committee. It's also important for this conference to consolidate a common African position established during the Environment Ministers' meeting held in Bamako, which not only defends adjustment to climate change and the commitment to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases, but also the assurance of funding by developed countries of sustainable projects for global development. These projects are above all essential for our continent, due both to the various climate phenomena affecting it, such as, for example, drought and desertification, as well as the urgent need to eradicate hunger and poverty and to put an end to widespread endemic disease in compliance with the Millennium Development Goals. Although they are not responsible for the increase of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, African countries and other developing nations are the ones that most suffer from its effects. And these are worsened by unsustainable agricultural activities, by poverty, and the lack of infrastructure and enough trained staff to respond to the challenges of climate phenomena. The continuous degradation of forests, the loss of soil fertility, and the reduction of food production as a result, the tendency of ever-worsening extreme climate phenomena, such as drought and floods, are the biggest challenges faced by countries of our continent. For this reason, the Common African Platform recognizes the need to preserve forests as carbon reservoirs and aims at the sustainable management of them, thereby avoiding forest degradation and applying adequate financial resources from public sources and from the carbon market specified in the Green Fund. In this regard, and in the capacity of acting chairperson of SADC, His Excellency President José Eduardo dos Santos urges its members to support the decisions contained in the African Platform and follow the guidelines of the African Union based on the Continental Strategy on Climate Change and the position of SADC and of the least developed countries on this issue. Excellencies, by ratifying the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in the year 2000 and the Kyoto Protocol in 2007, the Republic of Angola committed to fulfilling and implementing what is contained in these two important international legal instruments. In accordance with this, it approved in 2008 a strategy aimed at establishing the structure of intervention in the legislative, technical, and human fields so as to contribute to stabilizing the emissions of greenhouse gases and for the country's technological development. Therefore, apart from establishing a national action plan of adjustment to climate change, as a member of the least developed countries, structural and structuring investments have been approved and education awareness and upgrading activities have been implemented for a better understanding of the whole process relating to environmental conservation and adjustment to the harmful effects of climate change. The Kyoto Protocol stands as the only appropriate tool that is mature enough in terms of regulations, procedures, and legal structure, which enables the international community to remain committed to the efforts of reducing the effects wrought by greenhouse gases. As a result, there is a need to assume other commitments until the negotiation of a broader legal framework which can be agreed on and ratified by the parties. The global efforts of transition to a future where growth can face up to climate change and with lower emissions of greenhouse gases should be guided and regarded as of long-term and cover actions for reducing, adapting, funding, and transferring technology which would link to the creation of low-carbon economies. To put this into practice, the objectives and targets of these emission reductions should be based on scientific data and not only on economic points of view. These actions and considerations should be introduced into the Rio Principles, which recognize the historic responsibility of industrialized nations and protect the right to development of the countries in the process of achieving development. We hope that the Rio +20 summit, scheduled for June 2012, will provide the necessary space to renew the commitment of humanity in protecting the planet for current and future generations and safeguarding sustainable development. Thank you very much for your attention.
Monsieur le Président, cher frère Jacob Zuma,
President, my dear brothers of
Monsieur le Vice-Président, frère
heads of state,
de l'Angola,
President of Angola, Vice President of Angola,
le secrétaire exécutif de la Convention cadre des Nations Unies,
Madam Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change,
Monsieur le chef de délégation,
heads of delegation,
distingués invités,
distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I would like to express the special pride that my delegation and I have upon participating on behalf of the people and the government of Chad at the 17th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is being held in Durban in South Africa. I would also like to convey our warmest thanks to His Excellency Mr. Jacob Zuma, President of the Republic of South Africa, and I would also like to thank the government and the people of South Africa for their warm welcome and for all the hospitality that they have shown us since we arrived in South Africa. We would also like to congratulate the Executive Secretary of the Convention for the excellent organisation of this decisive meeting on such a crucial and delicate subject as climate change. Guests, ladies and gentlemen, we, the other Africans, without a doubt, more than other people today, are feeling the negative impacts of climate change, which seriously jeopardize the survival of whole swathes of our populations. COP17 remains the bridging period in terms of the 2008-2012 period, during which the industrialized countries took on the commitment of reducing their greenhouse gas emissions by 5%. Unfortunately, these industrialized countries, which are also the greatest polluters, have not complied with their commitment. We should bear in mind what took place in Copenhagen. It put an end to the hope for an effective fight against climate change. Even though Cancun revived hope in a minimum agreement. It's rather a story of saving face. It was not a solution. This means of behaving of the industrialized countries imperils the entire world. And it is a danger that will not spare the rich, nor will it spare the poor. Although the poor are most exposed to it. Small island states are heading towards certain disappearance when we consider the speed with which the glaciers are melting and freak wave events affect rich and poor alike. Heat waves in developed countries, despite the high technology that they have. All of these terrible problems must call on our collective conscience. This is why we remain strongly convinced is that what is most urgent is to develop greater international solidarity in order to tackle the problems that climate change poses. Such solidarity should allow us to envisage more holistic and more inclusive solutions. More specifically, it should allow us to envisage and plan robust solutions, such as the implementation of actions in the forests of the Congo Basin. The building, which is very important, of course, of the Great Green Wall in Africa, or the transfer of water from the Ubangi in order to refill Lake Chad. And I will stop with just these three examples. In Africa, Chad and the other countries of the Sahel region are bastions against the galloping advance of the desert. These countries are fighting hard against it despite their modest resources. In Central Africa, Chad remains the last bulwark protecting the forest basin of the Congo, which, along with the Amazon, allows the world to capture greenhouse gases. This bulwark must be protected by the entire world. But unfortunately, the industrialized countries are slow to come to this battle, which the member states of the Lake Chad Basin Commission are fighting to save Lake Chad. The CBLT allowing Lake Chad to vanish would be equivalent to collective suicide for the people, which would not just be one for the people living around the lake itself. That is why the transfer of water from the Ubangi to Lake Chad should be of interest to the entire world, and more particularly the member states of the Economic Community of Central African States. As acting president of the Economic Community of Central African States, I do not believe that it would be superfluous to recall that while the world expects a great deal from African states to safeguard our world due to the forest potential that a number of these countries have, our people also expect legitimate compensation in order to reduce their dependence on these resources to finance their development, or simply to ensure that they survive. Ladies and gentlemen, what could be more normal for our populations than to use our natural resources to meet people's needs, in particular their energy needs? But at the same time, what could be more dangerous for the environment than such anthropogenic actions, if we are to believe the specialists? That is why we must have a strong commitment to finding alternatives which bring together both our calls for development and the need to safeguard the environment. In this regard, the promotion of renewable energies seems to us to be one of the most promising outlooks. Therefore, we must invest in finding all the appropriate solutions and in researching them based on a shared concern for the well-being of our people. I I would like to take advantage of this opportunity to inform the participants here that the International Forum on Renewable Energy will be held from the 1st to the 4th of February 2012 in N'Djamena. And with the permission of my brother, President Zuma, I would like to invite you to participate. The countries of the G20, the big polluters of our planet, have the necessary resources and have proven advantages in this area, and they can play a role as a catalyst. The 17th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the 7th meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol, which are being held in Durban today, should give rise to concrete results, the implementation of which will ensure that the living conditions of our people improve. It is a matter both of the President but also of the future of humanity as a whole. Indeed, global warming with its negative impact has a clear influence on development. While climate change is considered to be a global problem which is slowing down the growth of our countries, well then the solution should be global, relevant, fair and effective, with a proactive spirit of solidarity and responsibility to ensure that all countries of the world in general and African countries in particular can benefit. In attending this important meeting, we, on behalf of the heads of state of the member states of the ECCAS and countries in Central Africa and their populations, we would like to share with the international community our concerns linked to climate change and their impact on the ecosystems of our countries. The most notable case is the drying out of Lake Chad. At this moment, this lake has 10% of its former surface area. It has gone from 25,000 square kilometers in the 1960s to around about 2,500 square kilometers today. The fourth biggest lake in Africa, with a basin of some 2,355,000 square kilometers shared between 9 countries. Lake Chad supports around 30 million people directly and 200 million indirectly. The impact of this change poses serious threats for biodiversity and for the existence of Lake Chad itself. The drying up of Lake Chad would affect more than the central basin of Africa. In fact, it would have negative, multiple and extended impacts on a large proportion of the continent. As you know, Chad now it has an advanced fund for desertification regarding the Congo Basin. If nothing is done to deal with this phenomenon. The Congo Basin, the second largest forest area and second largest world environmental green lung after the Amazon, would suffer disastrous environmental consequences and would therefore mean that the lives of millions of people were in danger. Therefore, there is a real threat to the environmental balance of the world. I would like to say that Central Africa is not responsible for climate change. Not even Africa itself. Africa, as Central Africa does too, is paying the price beyond the African continent. It is the African continent which emits the least greenhouse gas and is in fact one of those areas which is most vulnerable to the negative impact of climate change. This leads us to believe that environmental protection is closely linked to solidarity. This solidarity must be expressed between polluting developed countries and poor countries who are the victims of the pollution. I would like to clarify that apart from this call for international solidarity, Africa should have the resources to adapt to climate change or to mitigate its effects. Admittedly, Africa has proposed a financing plan, but we should also have more flexible mechanisms to implement. And these should ensure that the quality of life of our people continues to be upheld. This necessarily hinges on preserving the forest basin of the Congo, which plays a major role in protecting our sea coasts, which are threatened by erosion. Ladies and gentlemen, in fact, it is important to highlight and insist on the fact that no matter what their scope is, the individual efforts of each one of our states will remain marginal when facing the damage which has already been seen and that which is to come. That is why our summit must propose concrete solutions in terms of solidarity. The various topics of our summit must go as far as they can when dealing with this climate threat which is planned. Therefore, starting from today, we must reduce our vulnerability to climatic variations in order to avoid much greater environmental impacts which are expressed in material, financial terms, but also in terms of the loss of human lives. International solidarity should also prevail and contribute to all other considerations here too. In turning to my African brothers and sisters, I would like to say to them that Africa must play a significant role during this Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. If the industrialized countries, who are the great polluters of the environment, expect a great deal of African forests to capture the gases from their industries, it would be logical for them to also devote financial efforts and to streamline access procedures to financing. African countries must realize that without Africa, the effects of climate change that we are experiencing now would in fact be worse. That is why we remain deeply convinced that it is more urgent than ever to develop greater African solidarity first and then global solidarity in order to face up to the problems which climate change is posing at the moment. I'll return to the Bali Action Plan. So the 5 pillars, which are a shared vision, mitigation, adaptation, financing and technology transfer. These should enable an effective fight against climate change. Unfortunately, once again, industrialized countries who have committed to the Kyoto Protocol have not complied with their commitments. COP17, the last conference in the period of promises which have not been kept by countries under Annex 1 of the Kyoto Protocol, should give the occasion to take bold decisions to tackle climate change. The entire world, and Africa in particular, must work to renew the commitments adopted in the Bali Action Plan. For without a shared vision of how to fight climate change, without financing, without technology transfer, we will never fully address the negative effects of climate change. Thank you very much.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and delegates of the conference, please join me in welcoming the Honorable President of the Republic of South Africa, His Excellency, Mr. Jacob Zuma. Mr. President, you have the floor.
Thank you, Director of the Program. Your Excellency, the President of the Republic of Chad and Chairperson of the Economic Community of Central African States, President Deby, Your Excellency, Deputy President of the Republic of South Africa, Honorable Kgalema Motlanthe, Vice President of the Republic of Angola, Honorable Mr. F. dos Santos, Madam Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, the outgoing President of COP16 and the incoming President of COP17, Honorable Ministers and Deputy Ministers, the Executive Secretary of SADC, Honorable Premier of KwaZulu-Natal, distinguished delegates of states, parties, the diplomatic corps, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to South Africa and to the city of Durban in the beautiful province of KwaZulu-Natal. You are meeting in part of South Africa known for its rich history of bravery and military conquest displayed in the early years of our history under the reign of the legendary King Shaka, after whom our international airport you landed at is named. The KwaZulu-Natal province is also known for the scenic beauty, warm and friendly people, diverse and colorful cultures, as well as a stretch of golden beaches. We are welcoming you to a province which was home to some of the greatest leaders. Our country's first Nobel Peace Prize winner, Chief Albert Luthuli, and also at some point the legendary Mahatma Gandhi. Both were distinguished fighters for freedom, justice, and human rights for all. This is also the city and province in which the founding president of a free and democratic South Africa, our icon, President Nelson Mandela, cast his vote for the first time on the 27th April 1994, launching a new era of freedom and democracy in our country. We are therefore truly honored to host in this province and country the 17th Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, known commonly as COP17, and the 7th Conference of Parties serving as the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol known as COP17. We thank the United Nations for showing confidence in Africa's ability to host this meeting again after COP12, which was successfully hosted in Nairobi, Kenya in 2006. Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I've mentioned some of the outstanding leaders who taught us the power of reaching out to people who think differently from ourselves in order to find solutions to complex political problems. That is the spirit that should prevail in COP17 CMP7. With sound leadership, nothing is impossible here in Durban over the next 2 weeks. Your Excellencies, esteemed delegates, this meeting is taking place because climate change poses serious risks for humanity, especially in the developing world. Climate change can no longer be treated as just an environmental challenge. It is a holistic, sustainable development challenge. Various regions of the world have different views on the issues simply because they are affected differently by climate change. However, for most people in the developing world and Africa, climate change is a matter of life and death. We are always reminded by the leaders of small island states that climate change threatens their very existence. As the sea level rises, it is threatening to wipe them out of the face of the earth. Recently, the island nation of Kiribati became the first country to declare that global warming is rendering its territory uninhabitable. They have asked for help to evacuate the population. Africa's vulnerability does not only stem from climate change impacts such as the rise in the sea level, severe droughts, and floods. Africa is more vulnerable because of poverty, which limits the ability of most African nations to cope with the impact of climate change. Agricultural output in many African countries is expected to decrease by as much as 50% by the year 2050, which will cause serious food shortages. In some practical examples of impact, scarce grazing land is causing conflict in the Sudan amongst peoples that have previously lived in peace for centuries. Severe drought in Somalia is exacerbating an already volatile region, causing displacement of populations and increasing refugee communities in Kenya. In the Americas, we have also witnessed the frequency of intense hurricanes on the Gulf Coast from which the communities of New Orleans have yet to fully recover 5 years after Hurricane Katrina. In our own country, we have experienced unusual and severe flooding in coastal areas in recent times, impacting on people directly as they lose their homes, jobs, and livelihoods. Given the urgency, parties, states should strive to find solutions here in Durban. Negotiators will be building on the good work done in Cancun, Mexico, at COP17 CMP6. The message we wish to emphasize to negotiators is simple. The expectation is that you must work towards an outcome that is balanced, fair, and credible. You have before you the responsibility to reaffirm the multilateral rules-based system anchored by the Kyoto Protocol and to provide the funding needed to address impacts of climate change through activating the Green Fund. Another key issue on the table is the second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol and reaching agreement on the legal nature of a future climate change system. As this conference of the parties is taking place in Africa, adaptation is a key priority, particularly for small island states, least developed countries, and Africa. We also feel strongly that as an African conference of the parties, the COP17 outcome must recognize that solving the climate problem cannot be separated from the struggle to eradicate poverty. Informed by this view, as a responsible global citizen, South Africa is contributing its fair share to the global effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. At the COP17 in Copenhagen, we announced our commitment to reduce carbon emissions by 34% in 2020 and by 42% in 2025, with support from developed countries with regards to finance, technology, and capacity building. We have gone so much towards implementing this undertaking. Our new growth path